The wind in that part of the Wyoming Territory had a voice. It was not a whisper, but a long, mournful cry that scoured the land flat and stripped the spirit from anything that tried to stand against it. It carried the grit of the plains in its teeth and tasted of dust and distance. On this day, it howled over the fresh corpse of a stagecoach, its splintered yellow panels lying askew like the bones of some great beast felled on the trail. The wreckage was a testament to brutal, hurried violence. The horses were gone, cut from their traces. The driver, a man named Jedediah who chewed tobacco and told the same 3 stories on every run, lay twisted near the front wheel, a dark, motionless stain spreading from his chest into the thirsty dirt. The guard was nowhere to be seen, likely having fled or been taken. 2 bodies, passengers by the look of their city clothes, were sprawled nearby, their pockets turned inside out, their stillness an affront to the keening wind. It was this scene of quiet carnage that Samuel McCoy came upon as the sun began its slow bleed toward the horizon. He rode a rangy buckskin that moved with the same steady, unhurried gait as its rider. Samuel was a man carved from the land itself, all hard lines and sun-cured leather. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were accustomed to scanning vast, empty spaces, and they missed nothing. He saw the tracks of shod horses, at least 5 of them, heading east. He saw the boot prints around the bodies, the discarded shell casings glinting like brass teeth in the dust. He had seen this kind of work before. It was fast, ugly, and left no one behind to tell the tale. He dismounted, his worn leather chaps creaking a familiar song, and walked the perimeter of the disaster. His hand rested near the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, a gesture so ingrained it was no longer conscious thought. He was not looking for trouble, but he knew trouble had a way of finding a man in these parts, whether he was looking for it or not. He checked the passengers for any sign of life, a grim but necessary duty. Nothing. The wind whipped a loose page from a discarded book across the ground, a frantic, flapping ghost. Then he saw it, a flicker of white against the dun-colored earth, tucked in the shadow of the overturned coach. It was not the stark white of bone, but the sullied white of fabric. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on shattered glass. She was curled on her side, half hidden by a large, brass-bound trunk. A wedding dress, meant for a church aisle and promises, was now torn at the shoulder and hem, its delicate lace grimed with dirt and a smear of blood that was not her own. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had come loose from its pins and lay in a tangled mess across her cheek. For a moment, he thought she was another body for the scavengers, but then he saw the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of her back. She was breathing. He knelt, his movements careful, deliberate. He saw a purple bruise blooming high on her cheekbone, a raw scrape along her jaw. Her hands were fisted at her chest, knuckles white. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray piece of wreckage away from her face. Her eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a frightened doe. They were old, empty wells, devoid of shock or fear or anything at all. They were simply vacant, as if the soul behind them had retreated to a place no one could reach. She stared right through him, her gaze fixed on some distant point in the unforgiving landscape. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "The men who did this, they're gone." She did not respond. She did not even blink. Her chest continued its shallow, steady rhythm. He saw the track of a tear on her cheek, long since dried to a salty crust. She had already done her crying. He looked around again. The sun was sinking lower, painting the undersides of the clouds in bruised shades of orange and purple. A chill was settling into the air, the kind that promised a hard frost, maybe worse. Leaving her here was a death sentence. The wolves would come with the dark, or the cold would creep into her bones and finish what the raiders had started. The nearest town, Bitter Creek, was a good 10 miles east. It was a hard-scrabble place full of suspicious folks who would ask too many questions and offer too little help. They would see her torn dress, her bruises, and they would pass a cruel judgment before she ever spoke a word. They would see a fallen woman, a problem to be shunted off to the next town down the line. He knew this with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone. He had seen the town's brand of mercy before. "I have a cabin," he said, speaking to the empty space between them. "North of here. It's warm. Safe." He waited. The wind was the only answer, plucking at the torn lace on her shoulder. "You can't stay here." Her eyes finally shifted, moving from the horizon to his face. She studied him with that same unnerving emptiness. There was no plea in her gaze, no hope. It was the flat, assessing look of an animal gauging a threat. She was a thing that had been cornered, beaten, and was now deciding if this new presence was another predator. He stood slowly, giving her space, showing her his empty hands. "I mean you no harm, but the night is coming on, and it'll be cold." She pushed herself up, her movements stiff and pained. She swayed for a moment, her hand going to the side of the overturned coach to steady herself. Her pride was a physical thing, a ramrod straightness in her spine that defied the slump of her shoulders and the vacant horror in her eyes. She ignored his offered hand. Her attention was fixed on the brass-bound trunk. It was her only anchor in the wreckage. With a grunt of effort, she tried to pull it free from the debris. It was heavy, solid oak and brass, and it would not budge. Her breath came in ragged gasps, a flicker of raw frustration finally breaking through her blank facade. Samuel stepped forward. "Allow me." She flinched back as he approached, a small, sharp intake of breath. He stopped, holding his ground, letting her see he would come no closer than she allowed. After a long, silent moment, she gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. He moved past her, gripped the leather handles of the trunk, and with a single, powerful heave, wrenched it free. He set it down on the flat, open ground. She immediately went to it, her hands stroking the worn wood as if it were a living thing. She did not thank him. She did not even look at him. She just stood guard over her one remaining possession, her back to him, a solitary figure in a ruined dress against a dying sky. He brought his horse over. "We need to go, now." She turned, her eyes landing on the buckskin, then back to the long, dark road. She seemed to be weighing one unknown against another, the certainty of freezing to death on the plains, or the uncertainty of a stranger. In the end, survival, that most stubborn and basic instinct, made the choice for her. She walked toward the horse, her steps unsteady but determined. He tied her trunk down behind the saddle, the extra weight making the horse shift and snort. "Can you ride?" he asked. She only stared at him. He took that as a no. He mounted first, then reached down for her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze dropping to his outstretched hand. Then she placed her own in it. Her hand was cold, her fingers surprisingly strong. He pulled her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She was stiff as a board, her body held rigid, refusing to lean against him. He clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward at a slow, careful walk, leaving the dead and the wreckage to the wind. They had not been riding for more than an hour when the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a peaceful winter's day. They were hard and sharp, driven by the wind, stinging any exposed skin. The temperature plummeted. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of swirling white and encroaching darkness. The woman began to shiver. It started as a small tremor in her shoulders and soon racked her entire body. The thin fabric of her dress, already torn, offered no protection. Samuel felt the violent quaking through the saddle. Without a word, he unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped one side of it around her, and pulled it tight, cocooning her in its warmth. She jolted at the intimacy of the gesture, her muscles tensing as if expecting a blow. Her head was tucked just under his chin, and he could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. But she did not pull away. Instead, after a moment, a small, trembling hand crept up and clutched the front of his woolen shirt, her knuckles pressing into his chest. It was not a gesture of affection. It was the desperate grip of a drowning soul. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was from or where she was going. He did not ask about the men who had ambushed the stagecoach, or about the fiancé who had clearly abandoned her to them. The questions were a weight in his mind, but he knew they were useless. Her silence was a wall, and he would not try to break it down. He would just ride. They came to a creek, wider than a man could leap and too deep to risk the horse stumbling. In the summer, it was a gentle, gurgling thing. Now, its surface was a treacherous sheet of ice, too thin to hold their combined weight. "I have to carry you," he said, his voice low beside her ear. She stiffened again, but did not protest. He swung his leg over the back of the saddle and slid to the ground. He reached up for her, and this time she let him lift her, her body feeling frail and insubstantial in his arms. He held her tight against his chest and stepped onto the ice. It groaned and cracked under his boots. But it held. The water, black and frigid, swirled just beneath the surface. He could feel her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat, her breath a warm puff in the freezing air. She was trembling, but her grip on his coat was unwavering. For those few moments it took to cross the frozen creek, they were bound together by the simple, shared necessity of not falling. He stepped onto the snowy bank on the other side, the solid ground a relief under his feet. He walked the horse across after, then mounted and pulled her up behind him once more. He did not comment on the way she flinched from his touch, nor on the way she refused to let go. His cabin was little more than a dark shape against the snow-laden pines when they finally reached it. It was small, sturdy, built of logs he had felled and notched himself. A curl of smoke still rose from the stone chimney, a ghost of the morning's fire. It was not a home, not really. It was a shelter, a place to get out of the wind. Inside, it was Spartan and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with a single chair stood in the center of the room. A narrow bed was built into the far wall, covered with a thick buffalo hide. There was a small sleeping loft above, accessible by a simple ladder. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and coffee. It was the smell of solitude. He set her down gently on her feet just inside the door. She stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, her arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes darted around the small space, taking in the single door, the two small windows, the rifle resting on pegs above the mantelpiece. "There's a stew on the hearth," he said, moving to stir the embers in the fireplace back to life. "It's warm." She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. She went to the hearth, but not for the food. She sank to the floor before the growing flames, pulling a coarse wool blanket from a nearby stack and wrapping it around her shoulders. She drew her knees to her chest and stared into the fire, her posture that of a broken statue. Her wedding trunk, which he had carried inside and set by the door, remained untouched. He ladled some of the thick beef and vegetable stew into a bowl for himself and ate standing by the table. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scrape of his spoon against the tin bowl. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the snow falling outside. It was a living thing, filled with everything she was not saying. He gave her space. He did not push her to eat or speak. When he was done, he cleaned his bowl and set a pot of coffee to brew over the fire. He took his Colt from its holster, checked the load, and laid it on the small table beside her. The handle pointed toward her. Then he took his rifle from the wall, reloaded it, and leaned it against the wall by his own chair on the other side of the room. It was a silent conversation. The gun was there for her, a tool if she needed it, for her safety and for his, acknowledging that he was as much a stranger to her as she was to him. He sat and watched her. The firelight played across her face, softening the harsh lines of exhaustion and illuminating the stark bruise on her cheek. In the flickering light, he saw things he had missed in the gray dusk. Her hands, clenching and unclenching in the folds of the blanket, were not the soft, pale hands of a society bride from back east. Her knuckles were calloused, the skin on her palms rough. There was a small, faded scar that ran from her wrist to her thumb. These were the hands of a woman who knew hard work. Her eyes, still fixed on the flames, were not entirely blank anymore. They were watchful. He saw them flick from the fire to the revolver on the table beside her. Then her gaze slid to the heavy wooden door, where a simple bar served as the only lock. Then back to the fire. He could almost hear the thoughts turning in her mind. The gun was within her reach. The door was right there. She was thinking of escape. She was thinking of survival. The woman was still in there, somewhere beneath the ice. He let her be. He drank his coffee, cleaned the pot, and prepared for the night. He would take the floor by the fire. She could have the bed. "The bed is warmer," he said, his voice quiet so as not to startle her. She gave no sign she had heard him. He sighed, a soft sound lost in the howl of the wind outside. He laid his bedroll near the door and settled down, pulling a blanket over himself. He did not undress. He lay on his back, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, and listened to her breathing. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing orange coals. The blizzard raged, a wild thing clawing at the cabin walls. He must have drifted off, because the sound that woke him was not the wind. It was a scream. It was not a loud, piercing shriek, but a choked, guttural sound of pure terror, ripped from the deepest part of her. He was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for his rifle before he was fully awake. She was sitting bolt upright by the hearth, the blanket pooled around her waist. Her eyes were wide, staring at a horror only she could see. Her hands were covering her mouth, trying to stifle the sound that had already escaped. She was trembling so violently he could see it from across the room. His first instinct was to go to her, to offer comfort, but he stopped himself. The look in her eyes was that of a trapped animal. His touch, no matter how well-intentioned, would be a violation. It would be a threat. He stood there in the shadows, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the terror to pass. After a long minute, her trembling began to subside. She lowered her hands, her breath coming in ragged, hitching sobs. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself as small as possible, as if trying to disappear. He saw the buffalo hide he used as an extra blanket, folded neatly on the bed. He picked it up. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke and leather. He did not walk over to her. Instead, from across the room, he gave it a gentle toss. It landed softly in a heap beside her on the floor. She flinched at its landing, her head snapping up to stare at him, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. He said nothing. He just held her gaze, letting her see that he would not come closer. Her eyes dropped to the thick, warm hide. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and touched it. She drew it toward her, her movements achingly slow. She unfolded it and pulled it around her shoulders, burying her face in its coarse fur. He returned to his bedroll and lay down, turning his back to her to grant her the privacy of her grief. The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. He thought she had retreated back into that unreachable place. But then, a sound cut through the quiet. It was so soft, he almost missed it. A tiny whisper nearly lost to the dying fire and the howling wind. "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken. The words were fragile, hoarse from disuse and fear. But they were there, a single thread of connection, spun in the dead of a storm-tossed night. He closed his eyes, the two small words echoing in the darkness. It was a start. The blizzard blew itself out by dawn, leaving the world muffled and white. A profound silence had fallen, broken only by the occasional soft thump of snow sliding from the pine boughs outside. When Samuel rose from his bedroll, the woman was already awake, sitting in the same spot by the hearth, The fire had been fed with fresh logs, and the coffee pot was simmering on the grate. She had done this while he slept. It was a small gesture, a quiet offering of domesticity in the wake of the night's terror, and it spoke more than a dozen sentences could. She watched him now, her eyes no longer completely vacant. The emptiness was still there, a deep well of shadow behind her gaze. But now, a flicker of wary intelligence moved within it. She was assessing, calculating. He poured 2 cups of coffee, the steam rising in the cold air of the cabin. He set one on the floor a few feet from her, a respectful distance, and took his own to the table. They drank in silence, the cabin a small island of warmth in a vast, frozen wilderness. The quiet stretched, not as heavy as the night before, but taut with unspoken questions. He was the one to break it, his voice low and even. "My name is Samuel McCoy." She looked down into her tin cup, swirling the dark liquid. Her bruised cheek was stark in the morning light filtering through the small window. He waited, letting the silence do its work. He would not press her. He had offered his name. She could offer hers in return. Or not. After a long moment, her voice, raspy and thin, came from the fireside. "Clara." Just the one word. But it was a name. It was an identity reclaimed from the wreckage. She was no longer just the woman in the torn wedding dress. She was Clara. "Clara," he repeated softly, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. He took another swallow of coffee. "The road will be impassable for a few days. You are welcome to stay until it clears." She nodded, her eyes still fixed on her cup. The story came a little while later, not in a rush, but in broken pieces, like shards of glass from the stagecoach window. She spoke to the fire, her voice a monotone, as if recounting a tale that had happened to someone else. She had come from Ohio, a mail-order bride. Her passage paid by a man she knew only from 3 carefully worded letters that promised a prosperous ranch and a respectable life. A man named Alistair Finch. He was supposed to have been on that stagecoach, meeting her one stop before Bitter Creek to escort her the rest of the way to their new home. He had been on the coach. He had greeted her with a smile that did not reach his cold eyes and a grip on her arm that felt more like ownership than affection. And when the ambush came, it was no ambush at all. The riders were his associates. She was not a bride. She was cargo. Finch had taken her dowry money, a small inheritance from her parents, and then sold her on to men who ran a grim trade in the mining camps further north, a place from which women did not return. The driver, Jedediah, had tried to intervene. That was the last thing she remembered clearly before the world exploded into chaos and then darkness. She had been left for dead in the confusion, an oversight in their haste to flee. When she finished, a terrible stillness filled the cabin. Samuel's hands were clenched into fists on the tabletop, his knuckles white. He thought of the man's body he had seen. One of the passengers. It must have been Finch, caught in the crossfire of his own treachery. A small, cold comfort in a sea of ugliness. He looked at Clara. She was staring into the flames, her face a mask of stone. She had shed no tears while telling her story. The pain was too deep for that, a frozen river inside her. "Do you want to go back east?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. For the first time, a sound of genuine emotion escaped her. A laugh. It was a terrible sound, brittle and sharp, with no humor in it at all. It was the sound of something breaking. She finally looked at him, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "Go back," she echoed. "There's nothing left east. The farm was sold to pay for this passage. There is no one, and I'm no one's bride anymore." She said the word bride, as if it were a curse. Her gaze dropped to the ruined wedding dress she still wore, its sullied lace a mockery of the future that had been stolen from her. The fight was over. All that was left was the bitter, hollow ache of survival. The snow lingered for 3 days. During that time, a silent routine established itself. Samuel would tend to his few animals in the lean-to barn, chop wood, and hunt. Clara stayed inside, keeping the fire going, cleaning the cabin with a quiet efficiency that seemed instinctual. She found a needle and thread in his sparse supplies and began to mend the tears in her dress, her stitches small and neat. She moved like a ghost, taking up almost no space, making almost no sound. She ate the food he prepared, but only when he pushed a bowl into her hands, and she ate without appetite, simply fueling the machine of her body. On the fourth day, the sun returned, brilliant and blinding against the fresh snow. The trail was clear enough to travel. "I need to go to Bitter Creek," Samuel announced that morning. "For supplies." Clara's head snapped up. Fear, stark and raw, flashed in her eyes before she could hide it. "The town? People? Questions?" "You'll be safe here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." She nodded, clutching the mended fabric of her dress. He left her with the rifle and a pile of freshly chopped wood. The ride to town was cold, the air crisp and clean. Bitter Creek was not much. A single muddy street lined with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of shabby houses. It was a place where people kept to themselves and minded their own business, unless that business was more interesting than their own. Samuel tied his horse in front of the general store and went inside. The proprietor, a wiry man named Silas, greeted him with a nod. As Samuel gathered flour, coffee, and salted pork, he could feel the eyes of the other men in the store on him, a pair of trappers and a ranch hand, loitering by the pot-bellied stove. "Heard the stage was hit," the ranch hand said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "That's right," Samuel said, not turning around. "Heard they found Jedediah dead, and some fancy fella from back east." The man pressed, "But no sign of the bride he was coming to meet." The word hung in the air. Bride. Whispers traveled faster than a stagecoach in this territory. Samuel turned slowly, his face unreadable. He met the man's curious gaze with a flat, cold stare that offered nothing. "Is that so?" Samuel said. It was not a question. It was a wall. The man shifted, unnerved by the quiet intensity of Samuel's gaze. He mumbled something and turned back to the stove. But the seed had been planted. Samuel paid for his supplies, loaded them onto his horse, and rode out of town, the weight of those whispers following him like a shadow. When he returned to the cabin, Clara was standing by the window, watching for him. She unbarred the door before he reached it. She did not ask about his trip, and he did not volunteer any information. But a new tension had settled between them. The outside world, with its judgments and its dangers, had found its way to their isolated sanctuary. The proof came 2 days later. Clara was outside, gathering firewood from the pile he had stacked against the cabin wall, when 2 riders passed on the main trail below. They were far enough away that she was just a small figure in a white dress against the snow, but they saw her. They slowed their horses, pointing, their voices carrying faintly on the cold, clear air. She could not make out the words, but she heard the tone, a low, speculative murmur, followed by a coarse laugh. She froze, the wood dropping from her arms into the snow. They were talking about her. She was the story, the gossip, the bride from the ambushed stagecoach, the soiled woman that the solitary Samuel McCoy was hiding away in his cabin. She could feel their eyes on her like a physical touch, stripping her bare, judging her, labeling her. She turned and fled back into the cabin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She went straight to her trunk, the one she had not opened since the attack. She fumbled with the brass latch, her fingers clumsy and numb. Inside, her meager belongings lay neatly folded. A spare dress of simple gray wool, a brush and comb set, a small, leather-bound book of poetry. She began to pull the items out, her movements frantic and jerky. She would not bring this shame on him. He had shown her a quiet, undemanding kindness she no longer believed existed. He had given her shelter and safety. She would not repay him by making him a target of town gossip, by dirtying his name with her presence. She would leave. She did not know where she would go, but she could not stay here. She could not bear the weight of those whispers, the contempt in those men's laughter. She was trembling from head to toe, but her jaw was set in a line of fierce, defiant pride. Samuel found her like that when he came in from checking his traps. Her trunk was open, her few possessions scattered on the floor as she tried to pack. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I'm leaving," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was a thin, tight wire. "I heard them, the men on the trail. I know what they're saying in town." He stood in the doorway, blocking her only exit. He said nothing for a long moment, just watched her tremble, watched her fight to keep her composure. "So you'll let a few wagging tongues run you off into a wilderness where you won't last 2 days?" he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's not their talk," she retorted, her head snapping up, her eyes flashing with a desperate fire. "It's what they'll do to you. Because of me. I will not be the cause of any more trouble for anyone." He took a step into the room, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. She shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. He did not touch her. He just looked down at her, his expression grim. "You stay," he said. The words were not a request. They were a command. Soft but unbreakable. "You stay as long as you need. Not because they talk." He paused, his gaze boring into hers, forcing her to see the conviction in his eyes. "Because you're still breathing." Her defiance crumbled. The fire in her eyes guttered out, replaced by a wave of utter desolation. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She sank to the floor amidst the scattered contents of her life, and for the first time since he had found her, she let out a sob, a raw, wrenching sound of grief and exhaustion. He stood over her, a silent, unmoving guardian, and let her cry. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm, but something had shifted. The wall of her silence had been breached, not by his questions, but by her own pain and his refusal to let her run from it. She started talking more, not about her past, but about small things, the way the snow clung to the pines, the taste of the rabbit stew. It was a fragile, tentative peace. One morning, he found one of his calves shivering in the barn, its breath coming in shallow rasps. It was a sickness of the lungs that could take an animal down quickly. He worked all morning, forcing a warm mash of herbs and bran down its throat, wrapping it in blankets. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, watching. "I can help," she said quietly. He looked at her calloused hands, remembering his initial assessment of her. "You know cattle?" "I grew up on a farm," she said. "Before." He nodded and made space for her. For the next hour, they worked together in the cold, dim light of the barn. She was not clumsy or hesitant. She held the calf's head steady while he administered the medicine, her touch firm but gentle. She spoke to the animal in a low, soothing murmur. The work was messy and hard. Her hands, already rough, were scraped raw by the coarse blankets and the calf struggling. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on her palm. She did not complain or even seem to notice, wiping it absently on her skirt. He found himself watching her. He watched the determined set of her jaw, the focused concentration in her eyes. There was a strength in her, a deep, resilient core that her ordeal had not managed to break. She was a survivor, not a victim. Finally, the calf seemed to settle, its breathing easing. They stood up, their work done for now. She looked at her hands, at the dirt and the blood, and then she looked up at him. Their eyes met across the small, sick animal. For the first time, he saw something other than pain or fear or emptiness in her expression. It was a flicker of shared purpose, of mutual respect. And then, the corners of her mouth trembled, lifting almost imperceptibly. It was not quite a smile. It was the ghost of a smile, a faint, fleeting promise of one. But it was enough. It was like seeing the first hint of green after a long, hard winter. The moment passed, and she looked away, but he did not forget it. Later that week, he returned from another trip to town with a bolt of heavy canvas and a small card of cheap lace. He said nothing about it, but that evening, after she had retired to the small loft that served as her bedroom, he sat by the fire with a needle and his skinning knife. He was not a tailor, and his stitches were large and clumsy, but he worked with a slow, methodical patience. He measured her ruined wedding dress for the size and cut the rough canvas into the simple shape of a frontier woman's work dress. As an afterthought, he stitched the cheap lace around the collar and cuffs. It was a clumsy attempt at softness on a garment built for hardship. The next afternoon, she found it lying folded on her bed. She stood staring at it for a long time, her hand hovering over the rough fabric. It was a strange, contradictory thing. The canvas was practical, durable, meant for a life of work. The lace was a small, almost foolish touch of femininity. She did not know what to say. He had made her a dress. No one had ever made anything for her before. Later, when she knew he was outside, she took off the mended wedding dress for the last time. She folded it carefully and placed it in the bottom of her trunk, burying the past. She slipped the canvas dress on. It was heavy and stiff, and it smelled of canvas and wood smoke. It smelled like him. It fit. It was not elegant or beautiful. It was rough and imperfect, like her. That night, they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them. The wind had picked up again, moaning around the corners of the cabin. The sound seemed to dredge up something from deep inside her. "My brother, Thomas, he died protecting me," she said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel looked at her, surprised by the abrupt confession. "It was a long time ago," she continued, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "We were children. There were men. They were not good men. They came to our farm when our parents were away. Thomas, he was only 14. He stood between them and me. He tried to fight them." Her voice broke, and she stopped, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "They hurt him badly. He died 2 days later. He told me to run, but I just stood there. I did nothing." The guilt was a raw, open wound in her voice. Samuel's heart ached for the child she had been, for the woman she had become, forced to carry that burden alone for so long. His hand moved before his mind had caught up to it. He reached across the small space between them and laid his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. His fingers were rough and calloused against her skin. It was a simple gesture of comfort, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. She gasped, a small, sharp intake of breath, and her entire body went rigid. Her eyes, wide and startled, flew to his. He saw the flicker of fear in them, the ingrained expectation of pain. He immediately pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He had crossed a line. He had forgotten, for a moment, what she had been through. He had forgotten that a man's touch was not a comfort to her, but a threat. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, turning his face back toward the fire, his own shame a hot flush on his neck. She said nothing. The silence returned, now charged with a new, fragile tension. After a few minutes, she stood up. "Good night, Samuel," she whispered, and climbed the ladder to the loft without looking back. He sat by the fire for a long time, cursing his own foolishness. He had finally earned a sliver of her trust, and he had shattered it with a single, thoughtless gesture. But up in the darkness of the loft, Clara was not afraid. She lay on her cot, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly raised her hand, the one he had touched, and pressed it to her cheek. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his touch, the weight of it, the warmth that had seeped from his skin into hers. It had not been a prelude to pain. It had been gentle. It had been kind. It had been a moment of human connection, something she thought she would never feel again. She closed her eyes, the memory of his hand covering hers a burning ember in the cold darkness of her mind. A new feeling, one she could not name, stirred within her. It was a deep, aching loneliness, but it was threaded with a tiny, terrifying sliver of hope. She thought of him pulling his hand away so quickly, the shame in his profile as he turned to the fire. He had been afraid of frightening her. She touched the back of her hand, right where his had rested. She closed her eyes tighter, and a single, whispered phrase slipped from her lips into the silent, listening dark. "Don't stop." The quiet that had settled in the cabin was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. For weeks, Clara and Samuel moved around each other in a careful dance of unspoken understanding. He would leave for his trap lines at dawn, and she would have the fire going and coffee brewing when he returned, his presence filling the small space with the scent of pine and cold air. She mended his clothes with her small, neat stitches and learned to cook on the open hearth. Her early attempts often scorched, but always dutifully eaten by Samuel without a word of complaint. The memory of his hand on hers, and his swift, ashamed retreat, remained a silent, charged space between them. She found herself watching him more, noticing the way the muscles in his back moved as he chopped wood. The rare times the harsh lines around his eyes would soften as he watched the sun set. The outside world, however, had not forgotten them. Trouble arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a man on a tired-looking sorrel. A tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. He was a deputy from Bitter Creek, a man named Miller with a weak chin and eyes that were too close together. He reined in his horse a good 30 yards from the cabin, his hand resting self-consciously on the butt of his pistol. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his posture relaxed but radiating a clear, uncompromising warning. Clara watched from the shadows just inside the door, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. "So, McCoy," the deputy called out, his voice thin and reedy. "Sheriff wants a word with the woman you're keeping." Samuel's face was unreadable, a mask carved from stone. "She's not being kept, and the sheriff knows where I live if he wants to talk." "Now, see, that's the thing," Miller said, shifting in his saddle. "It ain't a social call. There were men killed during that stagecoach business, Finch and one of his associates. The story is the bride had something to do with it, that she wasn't as helpless as she might have looked. We need her statement." He squinted toward the dark doorway, trying to get a look at Clara. "Sheriff says to bring her in for questioning." "Bring her in." The words were a death knell. Clara shrank further into the shadows, the familiar cold terror seeping into her bones. The town, the questions, the cage of the law. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet that descended was more menacing than any shout. He took one slow step forward, off the porch and onto the hard-packed dirt. "You ride back to town," Samuel said, his voice a low, chilling rumble that carried easily on the still air. "You tell the sheriff that the woman is under my protection. You tell him she's been through enough." Deputy Miller's hand tightened on his pistol. "That ain't a choice you get to make. McCoy, this is the law." Samuel's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. He took another step. "Here's the only choice that matters right now. You can turn that horse around and leave, or you can try to get past me." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You touch her, I'll bury you where no one will ask." There was no bluster in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the flat finality of a closing coffin lid. The deputy's weak-chinned bravado evaporated. He looked at the unyielding figure of Samuel McCoy, at the rifle held so casually in his hand, and he saw a man who had made his peace with violence long ago. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He pulled on his reins, turning the sorrel in a clumsy circle. "This ain't over," he spat, trying to salvage a shred of his authority. "The sheriff will be back with more men." He kicked his horse into a hurried trot and disappeared down the trail, a small, pathetic figure of blustering retreat. Samuel stood watching until he was long gone, his body a rigid line of defiance against the vast, empty landscape. When he finally turned and came back inside, he found Clara pressed against the wall, her face as white as bleached bone. She was shaking, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her splintering courage together. "He'll come back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll come back, and they'll arrest you for helping me." "Let them come," Samuel said, leaning his rifle back in its place by the door. "No!" Her voice was sharp with desperation. "I will not have you harmed because of me. I should have left." "And I told you to stay," he said, his back still to her. "That hasn't changed." He turned to face her then, and the hardness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a grim resolve. "But he's right about one thing. It ain't over. They see you as a victim, an easy target. We need to change that." The next afternoon, he took her out to a clearing behind the cabin. In his hands, he held the Colt Peacemaker he usually wore at his hip. He held it out to her. "But first, you need to learn how to use this." Clara stared at the gun as if it were a coiled snake. The cold, heavy weight of it in her hand was a shock. It felt alien, an object of brutal power. All her life, guns had been something men used against others, tools of the violence that had shadowed her existence. The thought of wielding one herself was terrifying. "I can't," she whispered, her hand trembling so badly the long barrel wavered. Samuel moved to stand behind her, his presence a solid wall of warmth. He did not touch her, not yet. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice low and steady, close to her ear. "Fear is what they expect from you. This is how you answer." He placed his hands over hers, his fingers gently wrapping around her own, steadying her grip. His touch was firm, impersonal, a teacher's hold, yet it sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was the same shock of connection she'd felt that night by the fire, a startling, unexpected intimacy. His chest was a solid presence at her back, his arms bracketing hers, cocooning her in a way that felt less like a trap and more like a shield. "Feel the weight of it," he murmured, his voice a calm current in her sea of anxiety. "It's a part of your arm now. Point it at that old stump. Look down the sight. Line it up." She did as he said, her breath catching in her throat. Through the V of the rear sight, the weathered pine stump came into focus. His thumb gently guided hers to cock the hammer, the sharp clicks of the mechanism loud in the quiet woods. "Easy now," he said. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She closed her eyes and squeezed. The explosion was a deafening roar that seemed to tear the world apart. The gun kicked back, a solid, brutal force. But Samuel's hands absorbed the shock, keeping it from ripping from her grasp. Her ears rang. The sharp, acrid smell of burnt powder filled the air. When she opened her eyes, a fresh splinter of wood had been gouged from the side of the stump. She had missed the center, but she had hit it. She stood there, breathing hard, the gun suddenly heavy in her nerveless fingers. A strange, terrifying power hummed through her veins. It was the power to answer back, the power to say no. They stayed out there for an hour. He showed her how to load and unload, how to clean the weapon, how to stand so her body could absorb the recoil. With every shot, her fear lessened, replaced by a grim, focused competence. His hands stayed on hers, a constant, steadying presence, and with each moment, she grew more accustomed to his closeness, drawing strength from it until her own hands were steady, her own aim true. A week later, Samuel decided to break the wild Mustang he had captured a month prior. It was a magnificent creature, a streak of raw, untamed lightning with a coat the color of dried blood, and a black mane that whipped in the wind. Clara watched from the fence of the corral as he worked. He was a different man with the horse, a study in quiet patience and explosive power. He moved with a fluid grace, speaking in a low murmur, gentling the animal with his voice and his steady presence. He finally managed to get a saddle on its back, and with a single, fluid motion, he swung himself up. For a moment, the horse stood stock still, quivering with surprised fury. Then it erupted. It was not a ride, it was a war. The Mustang exploded into a series of jarring, bone-shattering bucks, its powerful hind legs kicking for the sky. Samuel rode the storm, his body moving with the horse, a part of its wild energy. And then it happened. The horse spun, a vicious twisting motion, and slammed itself against the corral fence. Samuel was caught off guard, his leg pinned for a split second between the horse's powerful body and the unyielding wood. He was thrown, landing with a sickening thud in the dusty corral. The Mustang, spooked and triumphant, galloped to the far side of the enclosure, snorting. Samuel did not get up. Clara was through the fence in an instant, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knelt beside him. He was conscious, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his teeth gritted against a wave of pain. "My shoulder," he ground out, his eyes squeezed shut. "Hit the post." She helped him sit up, his arm hanging limp at his side. He leaned heavily on her as she guided him, stumbling, back to the cabin. She eased him into the chair by the hearth, his face a mask of agony. His shirt, a coarse blue cotton, was already darkening with blood. A long, ugly splinter from the fence post had torn through the fabric and gouged a deep wound high on his chest, near his collarbone. "I need to clean it," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She was no longer the helpless woman from the stagecoach. She was the farmer's daughter who knew her way around an injury, the woman who had just learned how to face down her fear. She fetched the water basin, clean cloths, and the small bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. When she turned back to him, she hesitated. To get to the wound, she would have to unbutton his shirt. She would have to touch him. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the first button. It was small, made of polished bone. She fumbled with it, her knuckles brushing against the warm, solid plane of his chest. He did not move, did not speak, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching her every movement. She worked her way down, one button at a time, each one a small lifetime of hesitation and resolve. She pulled the fabric apart, exposing his skin. His chest was hard and lean, dusted with dark hair, a map of old scars, thin and white. Crisscrossed his skin, the faint track of a knife fight, the puckered mark of an old bullet wound. These were the stories of his life, a life of hardship and violence he never spoke of. The new wound was a raw, angry gash, bleeding sluggishly, with the jagged end of the splinter still embedded in the flesh. She took a deep breath and went to work. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned around the injury. When it came time to remove the splinter, she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. "This will hurt," she said softly. He gave a short, sharp nod. His jaw tight, she gripped the splinter with a pair of pliers and pulled. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his whole body going rigid. But he made no other sound. She quickly doused the open wound with whiskey. He flinched violently, a low groan escaping his lips, but he held still. She bandaged him with clean strips of linen, her movements deft and sure. When she was finished, her hands were slick with his blood. She knelt before him, the basin of reddened water at her feet. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken things. Their eyes locked, and the world seemed to narrow to the small space between them. His voice was hoarse, rough with pain. "No one's ever seen me like this." It was a confession of vulnerability, a crack in the armor of the self-sufficient, solitary man. She looked at his exposed chest, at the evidence of a hard-lived life, at the raw, fresh wound she had just tended. She thought of the nights she had lain awake in the loft, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, feeling a sense of safety that had been alien to her for so long. "No one's ever made me feel safe before," she replied, her voice a quiet revelation. The air crackled. He leaned in, his face slowly, hesitantly, moving toward hers. His eyes were dark with a mixture of pain and a raw, burgeoning desire that mirrored the frantic beating of her own heart. His breath was warm on her cheek. She did not pull away. She did not breathe. She waited. And then, just as his lips were about to touch hers, he pulled back. He looked away, a deep shame settling over his features. "You've been through enough," he said, his voice thick. "I won't be another man who takes something from you." He had misunderstood everything. He thought she was afraid. He thought this was an imposition, another violation. He could not see that her fear was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile yearning she did not yet have a name for. "Please," she whispered, the word so soft it was barely a sound. "Don't stop." He looked at her then, his eyes wide with surprise and a dawning understanding. He saw the truth in her gaze, the quiet plea. He raised a hand, his knuckles gently brushing her bruised cheek, a touch as light as a whisper. A silent battle was being fought behind his eyes, his desire against his fierce, protective instinct to keep her safe, even from himself. In the end, his honor won. He slowly stood, his movements stiff with pain and restraint. He walked to the door of her loft and then sank to the floor, his back against the wall. His injured shoulder slumped. "I'll be here," he said, his voice ragged, "if you have another nightmare." He stayed there all night, a silent guardian outside her door. He did not touch her, did not come to her, but his presence was a profound comfort, a promise kept. The next morning, she came down the ladder to find him asleep, his head slumped against his chest. She moved quietly, rekindling the fire. She was determined to do something for him, to offer a piece of normalcy, a simple act of care. She would make breakfast. It was a disaster. Her hands, still trembling from the emotions of the night before, were clumsy. She was distracted, her mind replaying the moment he had almost kissed her. The bacon burned, turning into blackened, brittle crisps. She dropped an egg on the floor. In her haste to brew the coffee, she tipped too many grounds into the pot, turning it into a bitter, muddy sludge. An acrid smoke filled the cabin. He woke to the smell. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing, and looked at the scene of culinary destruction. He saw the burned pan, the mess on the floor, and the look of utter despair on her face. She gestured helplessly at the blackened skillet. I tried." He walked over to the table, sat down, and pulled the plate of charred bacon toward him. Without a word, he picked up a piece and ate it, the crisp strip shattering in his mouth. He then poured a cup of the thick, bitter coffee and drank it down without flinching. He ate every last piece of the burnt offering, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. When he was done, he looked up at her mortified expression, and the absurdity of the moment finally broke through her wall of carefully constructed composure. A sound bubbled up in her chest, a strange, unfamiliar thing. A laugh. It was not the bitter, broken sound he had heard once before. It was soft and unsure, airy and light, a genuine expression of startled amusement. The sound was so unexpected, so precious, that Samuel froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He stared at her as if he were seeing the sun rise for the first time. The laugh transformed her face, chasing the shadows from her eyes and lighting her from within. It ended in a soft, tentative smile, her first real smile. The moment hung in the air, fragile and perfect. "Do it again," he said, his voice low and intense, almost a command. Her smile faltered, confused. "What?" "That smile," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Do it again." And she did. It was shy this time, but it was real. Her lips curved, her eyes crinkled at the corners. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He didn't know it then, but in that moment, in a smoky cabin over a plate of burnt bacon, something unspoken and unbreakable had been forged between them. He would have faced down a whole town of sheriffs for that smile. He would have fought the devil himself to see it again. That first real smile changed the air in the cabin. It was as if a window, long sealed against a storm, had finally been cracked open, letting in a sliver of fresh, clean light. A tentative warmth began to thaw the frozen silence that had defined their existence. They spoke more, their conversations weaving through the daily chores like a quiet thread. She asked him about the names of the birds that called from the pines in the morning, and he told her about the seasons on the plains, about the signs that foretold a hard winter or an early spring. He learned that her favorite color was the deep blue of the sky just before the stars appeared, and she learned he could not abide the taste of onions. They were small, simple things, the building blocks of a life, and they laid them down one by one, creating a foundation in the empty space between them. Samuel's shoulder healed slowly, a deep, aching reminder of the untamed spirit of the Mustang. The broken fence of the corral was a more pressing concern. A section of the post and rail fence had been shattered, a gaping wound in the enclosure that rendered it useless. They set to work on it together. Samuel, his left arm still not fully healed, could do the heavy cutting, his axe swinging in a steady, powerful rhythm that sent wood chips flying. But the lifting and setting of the new posts was difficult for him alone. It was here that Clara's strength, a thing he had only glimpsed, revealed itself fully. She was not a large woman, but the years of farm labor had layered her frame with a wiry, resilient muscle. She lifted the end of a heavy pine log, her jaw set in concentration, and helped him maneuver it into the hole he had dug. Her canvas dress, the one he had made, was tucked into her belt, and a fine sheen of sweat glistened on her brow. He found himself stopping his work just to watch her. He had seen her as a fragile, broken thing when he found her, a victim to be sheltered. But this woman, her hands braced on a heavy timber, her back straight and strong, was no one's victim. He watched the elegant, efficient curve of her spine as she bent to lift another rail, the way the relentless Wyoming wind caught loose strands of her honey-colored hair and whipped them across her cheek. She would push them away with the back of a dusty hand, leaving a smudge on her skin, and carry on with her work, oblivious to his gaze. A feeling, fierce and unfamiliar, began to simmer deep within him. It was more than the simple, protective instinct he had felt from the beginning. It was a raw, physical pull, a desire that was as unexpected as it was unwelcome. He was fiercely protective of her, of the fragile peace she had begun to find. This new feeling felt like a betrayal of that trust, a dangerous current that threatened to pull them both under. He would find himself staring at the soft line of her throat, or the way her dress pulled tight across her shoulders when she reached for something, and he would have to turn away, his jaw tight, his own hands clenching into fists. He was a man accustomed to solitude and self-restraint, but the nearness of her, the slow, steady rebuilding of not just a fence but a life, was beginning to erode his defenses. One hot afternoon, as they were setting the last post, a visitor appeared on the trail. He was a traveling preacher, a gaunt, stoop-shouldered man with a wild white beard and eyes that burned with a holy fire. His black coat was dusty and worn, and he led a mule laden with Bibles. He stopped at the edge of the property, his gaze taking in the small cabin, the half-repaired corral, and the man and woman working side by side under the vast, empty sky. "The Lord's blessings upon this house," the preacher called out, his voice a gravelly boom. He slid off his mule and walked toward them, his boots stirring up little puffs of dust. "It is a fine thing to see a husband and wife toiling together to build their home in God's wilderness." Clara froze, her hands still on the wooden post. A deep, startling blush crept up her neck and flooded her cheeks. She looked down at the ground, a wave of confusion and embarrassment washing over her. She glanced at Samuel, expecting him to correct the man, to explain the truth of their situation. Samuel simply wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm and nodded to the old man. "It's a hot day for travel. Preacher, can we offer you some water?" He did not correct him. He let the man's assumption hang in the air, unchallenged. He let the world see them as husband and wife. Clara's blush deepened, but beneath the embarrassment was a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. For a moment, she let herself imagine it was true, that this small cabin was her home, that the strong, quiet man beside her was her husband. The thought was both terrifying and exquisitely sweet. They gave the preacher a dipper of cool water from the well, and he offered them a long and rambling prayer for the prosperity of their homestead and the fruitfulness of their union. Clara stood with her head bowed, her hands clenched in the folds of her dress, her heart thumping a wild, uneven rhythm, when the preacher finally mounted his mule and continued on his way. A thick, charged silence descended between them. They did not speak of what had happened. They did not need to. They both knew that a line had been crossed, a possibility given voice. They finished their work on the fence, the space between them now humming with a new and palpable tension. That night, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy and still, the birds falling silent. A storm was coming. Samuel brought in extra firewood while Clara secured the shutters over the small windows. The first rumble of thunder came from far off in the mountains, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. Clara flinched, her hand flying to her throat. As the storm drew closer, the thunder grew louder, sharper, each clap a violent explosion that shook the very foundations of the small cabin. Lightning bleached the world white for a split second, followed by an immediate, deafening crack of thunder that sounded as if the sky were being torn in two. With each crash, Clara grew more and more agitated. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, haunted look. The storm was not just a storm to her. The sudden, violent noises were the echo of gunshots, of splintering wood, of the brutal end of her old life. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and huddled by the fire, but it offered no comfort. She was trapped in the memory of the ambush, the terror a living thing clawing at her from the inside. Samuel watched her from his chair across the room, his face etched with concern. He saw the way she jumped at every thunderclap, the way her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. A bolt of lightning struck a tree somewhere nearby, the crack of sound instantaneous and violently loud. The whole cabin seemed to jump. That was the one that broke her. A small, terrified cry escaped her lips. She scrambled to her feet, the blanket falling away, and without a thought, she fled. She did not go to the ladder that led to the safety of her loft. She ran across the room to the built-in bed where he slept, the place that had become the heart of this small sanctuary. He was on his feet an instant before she reached him. She collided with his chest, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, her face buried against his shoulder. She was trembling from head to toe, her body racked with silent, terrified sobs. For a moment, he stood rigid, his hands hovering in the air at his sides. His mind screamed at him to be careful, to remember his restraint, to not frighten her further. But the raw, animal terror he felt shaking through her body overrode everything else. He slowly, hesitantly, wrapped his arms around her, pulling her fully against him. He held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other pressed firmly against the small of her back, offering his own solidness as an anchor in the storm. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It's just thunder. You're safe here." She did not answer, just clung to him, her fear a palpable thing between them. They stood like that for a long time as the storm raged outside, a small island of humanity against the wild, violent night. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his ribs. Gradually, as he continued to hold her and murmur quiet words of comfort, her trembling began to subside. The rigid terror in her body softened into a weary, boneless weight against him. The storm began to move off, the thunder rumbling now in the distance. The rain softened to a steady, drumming rhythm on the roof. The immediate danger had passed, but neither of them moved. The nature of the embrace had changed. It was no longer just about comfort. It was about a profound, unspoken closeness. He was intensely aware of the shape of her in his arms, the scent of her hair, the soft warmth of her breath against his neck. She stirred, lifting her head from his shoulder. In the dim, flickering light from the fireplace, her face was a pale oval, her eyes dark and luminous with tears. Her lips were slightly parted. They stood there, caught in a moment of intense, breathless stillness. The world had shrunk to the space of a single heartbeat. And then, slowly, she rose on her toes. Her hands, which had been clutching his shirt, slid up to cup his jaw, her touch feather-light. And in the dark, quiet cabin, with the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, her lips found his. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate and trembling, a collision of loneliness and a fierce, aching need. It was the taste of rain and salt, and a longing so deep it had no words. He responded instantly, his restraint shattering like glass. His arms tightened around her, pulling her flush against him, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that had been simmering just beneath the surface for weeks. It was a kiss that spoke of unspoken desires, of shared pain, and of the fragile, terrifying hope of being found. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with an emotion so intense it stole her breath. He saw the question in her eyes, the vulnerability. She let him undress her, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the buttons of his shirt. Her whispered plea was almost lost in the sound of the rain. Be gentle. It was a prayer, a distillation of every fear and every hope she possessed. And he answered it. He laid her down on the buffalo hide that covered his bed, his touch reverent, his movements slow and deliberate. He treated her body not as a thing to be taken, but as a precious, long-lost treasure. Every touch was a question, every kiss a reassurance. For Clara, who had only ever known a man's touch as a prelude to pain or a transaction of ownership, this tender, patient exploration was a revelation. It was a healing. They made love in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, their movements slow and rhythmic, a silent conversation of aching need and profound, reverent care. It was not an act of passion, but an act of grace. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the heavy hide, the fire burning down to glowing embers. The rain had stopped. The world was washed clean and utterly still. Clara was curled into his side, her head resting on his chest, her ear pressed against the slow, steady drumbeat of his heart. It was the most peaceful sound she had ever heard. She traced a random pattern on his skin with her fingertip. "You make me feel like I matter," she whispered into the darkness. She was not just speaking of the act they had just shared. She was speaking of the dress he had made her, the food he had eaten without complaint, the way he had stood between her and the deputy, the way he had asked for her smile. His arm tightened around her, pulling her even closer. His voice was a low rumble from deep in his chest. "You do." 2 simple words, but they were the truest words she had ever heard. They were the validation of her very existence. A tear slid from the corner of her eye, then another, tracking a warm path into her hair. They were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of release, the breaking of a dam of unshed grief and loneliness that she had carried inside her for years. She cried silently in the warm, safe darkness of his arms, and he held her until she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. In the morning, a soft gray light filtered into the cabin. Samuel woke first. Clara was still asleep beside him, her face peaceful, the haunted look gone from her features. He watched her for a long time, a fierce, protective feeling swelling in his chest that was so powerful it almost hurt. He gently extricated himself from her embrace and rose, pulling the hide up to cover her bare shoulders. He was outside, splitting wood for the morning fire. When she emerged from the cabin, she was dressed in her canvas dress. She did not meet his eye at first, a shy blush on her cheeks. But when she did finally look at him, Her smile was soft and certain. Later, he found her sitting by the fire, not cooking or cleaning, but sewing. He saw that she had taken in the seams of the canvas dress, making it fit her more snugly at the waist, giving the rough garment a shape that was distinctly hers. It was a small, domestic act, but he understood its meaning with perfect clarity. It was the act of a woman who was no longer just taking shelter. It was the act of a woman who planned to stay. The fragile peace of this new world was shattered 2 days later. A lone rider approached the cabin. Not the deputy, but Silas, the wiry owner of the general store. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected trouble. "Samuel," he said, not dismounting, "I thought you should know. The sheriff, he issued a warrant for her." He nodded toward the cabin where Clara stood watching from the doorway. Samuel's face hardened. "A warrant for what?" "Those men who were with Finch," Silas explained, his voice low and hurried. "The ones who got away. They made it to the next county and told a story. They're claiming she was in on it with them, that she helped them plan the robbery and then stole their share of the money from them. They're painting her as a thief and a murderess." The injustice of it was a bitter pill. The very men who had bought and sold her were now using the law as a weapon to silence her, to destroy her. "It's a lie," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. "I know it, and you know it," Silas said, wringing his hands. "But they've got a judge to listen. The warrant is real. The deputy is forming a posse. They'll be coming for her, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day." He looked at Samuel, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. "I'm sorry. Samuel, I just thought you ought to have a warning." He kicked his horse and galloped away, not wanting to be there when the trouble started. Samuel turned and went back into the cabin. He took his rifle from its pegs and began to clean it with methodical, deliberate movements. Clara came to stand before him, her face pale but her eyes clear and resolved. "I have to leave," she said, her voice steady. "This is my fight. They want me, not you. I will not let them harm you for protecting me." He did not look up from his work, his hands moving over the oiled steel of the rifle. He slid the bolt home with a final, metallic click that echoed in the quiet cabin. Then he looked at her, his eyes as hard and cold as river stones. "They'll have to go through me." They did not have to wait long. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the plains in shades of bruised purple and gray, they saw the lights, a string of them, like angry fireflies, bobbing through the trees at the bottom of the trail. Torches. Samuel blew out the single lantern that lit the cabin, plunging them into a thick, expectant darkness. The murmur of voices, a low and ugly sound, drifted up to them on the evening air. It was not the sound of the law. It was the sound of a mob. "The cellar," Samuel said, his voice a low command. He pulled up a wide plank in the floor near the hearth, revealing a dark, square hole that smelled of damp earth and stored potatoes. He handed her a rifle and a small pouch of extra ammunition. "Get in, and no matter what you hear, you do not come out." Clara's hands were ice cold as she took the weapon. She looked from the cellar to his face, her eyes wide and pleading in the dim light. "Come with me. We can hide. We can wait until they are gone." "They won't leave until they've burned this cabin to the ground," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They're not here for a conversation." He nudged her toward the opening. "Go, now!" She descended the short, rickety ladder into the small, claustrophobic space. It was barely high enough for her to stand upright. He passed down a jug of water and a lantern. Unlit. He was about to replace the floorboard when she reached up and grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't do this," she begged, her voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Please, Samuel, don't die for me." The ghost of her brother's sacrifice, a memory she had carried like a stone for years, rose up to choke her. He looked down at her, and, in the faint light from the dying embers in the hearth, his harsh features softened. He reached down and cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she had shed. "You smiled for me," he answered, his voice so quiet she could barely hear it over the pounding of her own heart. "That's worth it." He pulled his hand away and slid the plank back into place, sealing her in darkness. She heard the scrape of the bearskin rug being pulled over the top, concealing the entrance. Above her, she could hear his boots on the floorboards as he moved to the window, the faint, metallic click as he cocked his rifle. The voices were closer now, just outside the cabin. "McCoy, we know you're in there. Send out the woman. The sheriff just wants to ask her some questions." It was Deputy Miller's reedy voice, trying and failing to sound authoritative. "She's not here," Samuel's voice boomed through the cabin walls, a solid wall of sound. "You've been chasing shadows. Now get off my land before you get hurt." A coarse laugh answered him. "We ain't leaving without her. We know she's with you, McCoy. You and your soiled bride." The insult, crude and deliberate, hung in the air. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. The rifle clutched to her chest. Then came the sound of a rock shattering a window, followed by the roar of Samuel's rifle. The war had begun. From the cellar, the sounds were muffled and terrifying. The boom of Samuel's rifle, the answering crackle of a dozen other guns, the thud of bullets hitting the log walls of the cabin, the shouts of angry men. The smell of gunpowder began to seep through the floorboards. She huddled in the corner, her body shaking uncontrollably, her mind a maelstrom of fear. Every shot was a potential death, every shout a prelude to disaster. This was her fault. He was up there, fighting a dozen men because of her. The shootout seemed to last an eternity. Then there was a different sound, a cry of pain from above, sharp and quickly stifled, followed by a heavy thud that vibrated through the floor above her head. It was Samuel. A terrible silence fell. Clara held her breath, her ears straining. Had they killed him? Were they coming for her now? "He's down!" a voice shouted from outside. "Let's go get the woman!" Raw, adrenaline-fueled instinct took over. She could not let them take him. She could not let him die alone. Scrambling up the ladder, she pushed with all her might against the floorboard. It barely budged. The rug and a heavy wooden chest had been moved on top of it. She pushed again, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her shoulders screaming in protest. The board lifted a few inches. It was enough. She squeezed through the narrow opening and into the smoke-filled cabin. The air was thick and acrid. Samuel was lying on the floor near the overturned table he had been using for cover. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his thigh, his trousers soaked with blood. His face was pale, but his eyes were open, blazing with a mixture of fury and pain. "Get back down there," he growled, trying to push himself up. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The front door burst open. Two men, their faces illuminated by the torchlight from outside, stood silhouetted in the doorway, their rifles raised. Clara did not think. She reacted. She raised the rifle Samuel had given her, the one she had practiced with until her arms ached, and fired. She did not aim to kill. She aimed for the doorframe, just beside the first man's head. The roar of the gun was deafening in the enclosed space. Wood splintered, and the man yelled in shock, stumbling backward into his companion. It was the only distraction she needed. She grabbed Samuel under his arms, his dead weight a staggering burden. "Help me," she grunted, adrenaline giving her a strength she did not know she possessed. He pushed against the floor with his good leg, his teeth gritted, a low groan of agony escaping his lips. Together, they stumbled toward the back of the cabin, where a small door led out to the woodshed. They crashed through the back door just as the men in front recovered and began to fire into the cabin again. Bullets whizzed past them, thudding into the log walls. She did not stop. She dragged him out of the woodshed and into the deep, welcoming darkness of the pine forest. The shouts and gunshots faded behind them as she pulled him deeper and deeper into the trees. his blood leaving a dark trail on the pine needles behind them. They found refuge in an old, abandoned silver mine that Samuel had shown her once on a walk, a dark scar in the side of a hill. The entrance was choked with brush, but she managed to pull him inside, into the cool, damp blackness. She collapsed beside him, her lungs burning, her body screaming with exhaustion. They were safe. For now. For 2 days, the mine was their world. Samuel's leg was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, but he had lost a lot of blood, and the wound was hot and angry. Fever set in. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning one moment and racked with chills the next. Clara tore strips from her petticoat to bind his leg, using the last of their water to clean the wound as best she could. She did not sleep. She sat beside him in the darkness, her hand on his forehead, her presence a constant, desperate vigil. When he was lucid, he was grim and silent, but when the fever took him, he would talk, his words a jumbled stream of memories from a life he never spoke of. A cattle drive in Texas, a bar fight in Dodge City, the name of a horse he had loved as a boy. And in those long, dark hours, to keep him tethered to the world, to keep him from slipping away into the fevered darkness, she talked to him. She whispered stories from her own childhood, stories she had not thought of in years. She told him about the farm in Ohio, about the smell of the hayfields after a summer rain, about the brother who had taught her how to fish in the creek behind their house. She spoke of her mother's flower garden, of the simple, peaceful life that had been stolen from her. She poured out her memories, her voice a soft, continuous thread in the oppressive silence of the mine, a lifeline of words to keep him from drowning. On the second night, his fever was at its worst. He was thrashing, his skin burning to the touch. He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Clara," he mumbled, his voice thick and slurred. He struggled to focus on her face. "Marry me." She froze, her heart stopping in her chest. "Marry me when this is over," he repeated, his words a desperate, fevered plea. "Don't want to be alone anymore." She knew it was the fever talking. It was a delirious dream born of pain and darkness. A sane man would not ask a ruined woman with a warrant for her arrest to be his wife. But hearing the words, even in a delirium, was like a balm on her wounded soul. It was a vision of a future she had never dared to imagine. She leaned down, her own tears falling onto his hot cheek, and kissed his brow. "Yes," she whispered, the word a sacred vow in the darkness. "Yes, Samuel, I will." He seemed to relax at her words, his grip on her hand loosening, and he slipped back into a restless sleep. But Clara knew what she had to do. Whispers and fevers were not enough to build a future on. He needed a doctor, or he would die in this dark hole in the ground. And the only doctor was in Bitter Creek, the very town that had sent a mob to kill them. Before dawn, she slipped out of the mine. She moved through the woods like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the pine needles. She approached the town not from the main road, but from the back, coming in behind the row of houses like a stray dog. She went straight to the general store, not to see Silas, but to find his wife, a stern, quiet woman named Martha Gable. She found her out back, shaking a rug with brisk, angry snaps. When Martha saw Clara, her face hardened. She had heard the stories. She saw a troublemaker, the soiled bride. Clara did not have time for pride. "Please," she said, her voice raspy from a dry throat and lack of sleep. "It's Samuel. He's been shot. He has a fever. He'll die if he doesn't see a doctor." Martha's expression flickered. She looked at Clara, really looked at her for the first time. She saw the dirt and blood on her canvas dress, the dark circles under her eyes, the raw desperation that had stripped away everything but the will to save him. She had also heard the whispers from the men who had returned from the failed raid, stories of how the woman had fired back, how she had dragged the wounded McCoy into the woods under a hail of bullets. They spoke of it with a grudging, surprised respect. Martha Gable was a practical woman. She understood sacrifice. And she saw it standing right in front of her. "Wait here," she said, her voice curt. She disappeared into the house and returned a moment later with a shawl and a small bundle of bread and cheese. "The doctor lives at the end of the street. I'll go with you." The doctor, a weary man with kind eyes, listened to the story and then packed his bag without a word. The women of the town, drawn out by the commotion, gathered in a small, silent group. They had once been so quick to judge her, to whisper about her. Now, they saw something else. They saw the woman who had risked everything for the man who had sheltered her. One of them pushed a small bottle of laudanum into her hands. Another offered a blanket. It was a quiet, profound shift in the tide of their opinion. A moment of grace in the heart of the town that had condemned her. The doctor saved him. He cleaned the wound properly, stitched it closed, and administered a dose of medicine that broke the fever. They moved Samuel back to the cabin, which was riddled with bullet holes but still standing. For the next week, Clara nursed him, her devotion absolute, and when he was finally out of danger, she went to Martha Gable. "I need work," she said. "I have a debt to pay. For the doctor, for the supplies." Martha hired her to work in the mercantile. Clara swept the floors, stocked the shelves, and learned to measure out flour and sugar for the same women who had once scorned her. She worked from sunup to sundown, her hands growing rougher, her silence speaking more than any words. She never complained. She never explained. She simply worked, and the town, in its slow, grudging way, began to respect her. They stopped calling her that woman. They started calling her Clara, and sometimes in whispers that were no longer cruel, but tinged with a strange sort of admiration. They called her the bride who stayed. One afternoon, a rough-looking drifter, new to town, was in the store. He watched Clara as she worked, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. When she was alone in the back, stacking crates, he cornered her. "Heard you were for sale once," he sneered, his breath sour with whiskey. "Wonder what the price is now." He reached for her. He never touched her. In a single fluid motion, she produced the Colt revolver that had been tucked into the waistband of her skirt, hidden by her apron. It was Samuel's gun. She cocked the hammer, the sound loud and final in the small storeroom. The man froze, his eyes wide. She did not point it at his chest. She pointed it at the floor by his feet. "No, man," she said, her voice low and steady, a thing of forged steel. "Takes what I don't give." She fired. The shot was deafening. A splinter of wood flew from the floorboards, inches from his boot. The man yelped and scrambled backward, falling over a sack of beans in his haste to get away from her. He fled the store and was out of town by nightfall. From the doorway, Samuel stood watching, leaning on a rough-hewn crutch. He had been coming to walk her home. He had seen the whole thing. He did not look angry or surprised. He looked proud. He looked awestruck. Later that night, as they sat by the fire in the quiet of the cabin, he finally spoke of it. He reached out and took her hand, the one that had held the gun so steadily. "I knew you were strong," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "But I didn't know you were fearless." The hard winter finally broke its grip, retreating from the plains like a beaten army. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a vibrant, riotous explosion of life. The snow melted away to reveal a carpet of new green grass, and the stark gray landscape was suddenly stippled with the brilliant colors of Indian paintbrush, bluebonnets, and wild primrose. The air, once sharp and sterile with cold, now carried the rich, loamy scent of thawing earth and the sweet perfume of cottonwood blossoms. The world was being reborn, and with it, so were they. Samuel walked with a permanent limp, a slight rolling gait that was a constant reminder of the night the cabin was besieged. The bullet had healed, but the muscle had been torn badly, leaving its mark. It was a scar he wore on the outside, a testament to the price of their safety. He never complained about it, but Clara saw the way he favored it after a long day, the tight line that would sometimes appear around his mouth. In those moments, she would come and quietly rub the knotted muscle, her hands working with a gentle, knowing pressure until the tension eased from his face. They spent their days mending. The bullet holes in the cabin walls had been plugged with a mixture of mud and dried grass. The corral fence, once a symbol of his injury, was now a sturdy, completed enclosure. They worked on the long line of fence that marked the edge of his property, a task that would take them weeks. They fell into an easy, comfortable rhythm, a partnership that needed few words. He would dig the post holes and set the heavy timbers, and she would follow behind him, stretching the wire, her hands, once soft and then calloused, now becoming strong and deft. The silence that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a current of easy conversation and shared laughter. The sound of her laugh, once a thing so rare and fragile, was now a frequent and welcome music in the vast emptiness of the plains. He would tell her a dry, understated story about a stubborn mule, and she would laugh until tears came to her eyes. She would recount a mishap at the mercantile, a dropped sack of flour that had covered Silas Gable in a fine white dust, and he would let out a low, rumbling chuckle that seemed to come from the deepest part of his chest. The careful distance between them had vanished. Their touches were now easy and frequent. A hand on his arm to steady him when his leg was tired, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. They would walk back from the fence line at the end of the day with his arm around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him, their limping, steady gait a perfect, synchronized rhythm. They were two broken pieces that had, against all odds, found a way to fit together, creating a whole that was stronger than either of them had been apart. The past, however, still cast a long shadow. The warrant for her arrest, though unenforced by a town that had come to respect her, still existed. It was a loose thread, a potential unraveling of the peaceful life they were so carefully weaving. The news that would cut that thread for good arrived on a bright, wind-swept morning in late May. It was brought by the traveling preacher, the same one who had mistaken them for husband and wife months before. He was on his way back from the county seat and carried a small bundle of mail for the outlying homesteads. Among them was a long, official-looking envelope, addressed simply to the woman known as Clara, residing at the McCoy homestead. Clara's hands trembled as she took it. Her blood ran cold. Official envelopes meant trouble. They meant the law, judges, and the cold, hard finality of a sentence. She stared at the unfamiliar handwriting, her throat suddenly tight. "What is it?" Samuel asked, his voice low and concerned, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "I do not know," she whispered. She could not bring herself to open it. He took the letter from her nerveless fingers. "Let's see what it says together." He slid it open with his pocket knife and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. He began to read aloud, his voice slow and steady. It was a formal notice from the district judge, the men who had attacked the stagecoach, the ones who had accused her of being their accomplice, had been apprehended in the next territory while trying to sell a stolen herd of cattle. During their interrogation, one of them, hoping for a lighter sentence, had confessed to the whole sordid affair, the ambush, the murder of the driver, and the planned sale of a mail-order bride named Clara. The letter stated in dry, legalistic terms that their confession exonerated her completely. All charges against her had been formally and permanently dropped. She was a free woman. The paper fluttered in Samuel's hand. He finished reading and looked at her. Clara had not moved. She stood staring at the far wall, her eyes wide and unseeing. A single tear tracked its way down her cheek, then another. The last chain that had bound her to her past had just shattered. The weight of the warrant, the fear of the law, the shame of the accusation. It all fell away in an instant, leaving her feeling dizzy and weightless. She let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half sob, half sigh of relief. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She buried her face in his shirt, and finally allowed herself to weep. Not for the pain she had endured, but for the simple, overwhelming fact that it was finally, truly over. That evening, they sat on the small porch of the cabin, watching the sun set. The sky was a magnificent canvas of orange, pink, and gold. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer a void to be filled, but a shared space of peace. Clara leaned her head against his good shoulder, his arm a solid, comforting weight around her. The letter lay on the small table between them, a testament to her freedom. Samuel cleared his throat. He shifted, turning to face her more directly. He took her hand in his thumb stroking the back of it. "Clara," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. "The first time I asked you this, I was half out of my mind with fever in a dark cave." Her heart began to beat a little faster. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his in the fading light. "I am not in a fever now," he continued, his gaze direct and unwavering, "and my mind has never been clearer. I know I do not have much to offer, just this small cabin, a piece of hard land, and a future that is likely to be more work than rest." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I cannot imagine that future without you in it. Will you marry me, Clara?" The question was simple, direct, and utterly sincere. It was not a fever dream. It was a real and tangible offer of a life, a partnership, a home. She looked at his earnest, weathered face, at the kind, steady eyes that had seen her at her most broken and had never once looked away. She thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the rescue, the shelter, the shared dangers, the quiet moments of healing. She thought of the first time she had truly felt safe in his arms, the first time she had laughed a real laugh, the first time she had dared to hope. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that lit her eyes and transformed her features. She did not give him a simple yes. She gave him something more. "Samuel," she said, her voice soft but certain. "I already gave you my first real smile." She squeezed his hand. "You have had my heart since then." They were married 2 weeks later, not in a church, but in the small field behind the cabin, the one that was now carpeted in a thick blanket of bluebonnets. The traveling preacher, who had delivered the letter and been delighted to hear his initial assumption was coming true, agreed to officiate. The guests were few but significant. Silas and Martha Gable came, Martha pressing a freshly baked loaf of bread into Clara's hands and giving her a rare, tight-lipped smile of approval. The doctor was there, and a few of the other townswomen who had helped her. They stood in a small, quiet circle, surrounded by wildflowers and the vast, benevolent sky, their presence a silent testament to the redemption they had all witnessed. Clara wore her canvas dress, the one he had made for her. She had washed it carefully and stitched a new, cleaner piece of lace around the collar. Samuel wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. They did not have rings. Instead, they exchanged simple, heartfelt vows, their words carried away on the gentle spring breeze. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Samuel did not kiss her with the desperate passion of that first stormy night. He kissed her with a deep, tender reverence, a promise of a lifetime of quiet devotion. Their wedding night was not a discovery, but a homecoming. They lay together in the bed that was now theirs, the soft light of a single candle casting flickering shadows on the log walls. He undressed her slowly, his touch familiar and gentle, his eyes full of a love so profound it made her ache. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation, only a deep and abiding sense of peace. Later, as she lay curled in his arms, listening to the peaceful rhythm of his breathing, she thought about the woman she had been, the one who had arrived in this territory in a tattered wedding dress, empty and broken. She thought of all the things he had given her: shelter, safety, kindness, and love. But the greatest gift he had given her was the one she was just now beginning to understand. She rose on one elbow and looked down at his sleeping face. "You saved my life," she whispered into the quiet of the room. "But what matters is, now I want to live it." The months that followed were filled with the hard, satisfying work of building a life. The harvest was good, and their small herd of cattle grew. Samuel's limp became less pronounced as his leg grew stronger. Clara's presence transformed the small, Spartan cabin from a simple shelter into a real home. She planted a small garden of herbs and vegetables by the back door and put up curtains made from bleached flour sacks. One afternoon in the late fall, she returned from her work at the mercantile to find Samuel standing proudly beside a new addition to the cabin. He had spent the last month, while she was in town, building a small room off the side. It was not large, but it had a wide window that faced the morning sun. She stepped inside, her heart catching in her throat. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine. Against one wall, he had built a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, and the bookshelf was full. He had traded 2 of his best horses for them. There were novels by authors she had only dreamed of reading, books of poetry, volumes of history, books about botany and art from the East. It was a library, a window back to a world she thought she had lost forever. It was a gift that had nothing to do with survival or necessity. It was a gift born purely of his knowledge of her, of his desire to feed her mind as well as her body. She turned to him, her eyes flooded with tears. She could not speak. She simply walked into his arms and held him. "No one has ever given me something just because they knew I would love it," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with an emotion so overwhelming it left her breathless. Clara continued to wear her canvas-lace dress with a quiet pride. It was the uniform of her new life, a symbol of her resilience. She was no longer just the woman from the ambushed stagecoach. She was Clara McCoy, a respected member of the community, Samuel McCoy's wife. She would walk through town on his arm, her limp a perfect counterpoint to his, her chin held high, meeting the eyes of the townsfolk with a calm, steady gaze. One day, as they were leaving the general store, a pair of strangers passing through town watched them. One of them nudged the other, his voice a low, speculative murmur, just loud enough for her to hear. "Look there. I hear that is the bride from that stagecoach mess last year. The one who—" He did not get to finish his sentence. Clara stopped and turned to face him. She did not say a word. She did not reach for the gun she no longer needed to carry. She simply looked at him, and she smiled. It was not the fragile, uncertain smile he had first coaxed from her. It was not the shy, happy smile from their wedding day. This smile was different. It was radiant, confident, and utterly, completely free. It was the smile of a woman who had faced down the very worst of the world and had not only survived, but had triumphed. It was the smile of a woman who was finally, truly home. Thank you for being a part of our story today. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow fans. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.